All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today we're heading into the world of global politics and diplomacy. Specifically, we're looking at a moment, a pretty tense moment actually, at the recent Munich Security Conference. That big meeting of world leaders all talking about global security.
Yeah, the Munich Security Conference, it's usually a time when, especially Western countries, the US and Europe, they try to show they're all on the same page, especially when it comes to, well, like you said, security. But this year, let's just say a speech by the US Vice President J.D. Vance kind of threw a wrench in the works.
Yeah, I was reading about this. It sounds like his speech, it really ruffled some feathers with a lot of the European leaders who were there. Some were even saying he was attacking European values. So what exactly did Vance say that got everyone so riled up?
Well, I think the main thrust of his argument was that European leaders are, well, hypocrites. Basically, he was saying that Europe talks a big game about democracy, but then does things that go totally against those very same democratic principles.
Okay, so that's a pretty serious accusation. What specific examples did he give to back that up?
One example he brought up was the Romanian presidential election. The guy who won, Kylian Georgescu, he was all about getting closer to Russia, which, as you can imagine, is not exactly a popular stance these days. So Vance is saying that when the Romanian government basically threw out the election results, a lot of European officials were, well, kind of happy about it.
So he's suggesting that Europe is interfering in elections to make sure the outcome fits with their own interests.
Exactly. And he went even further, comparing it to all the talk about Russia interfering in elections, pointing out the irony that the same people who condemn Russia are now being accused of doing the same thing. It was a comparison that a lot of people in the audience didn't take too well.
Yeah, I bet. What about this censorship thing, though? What evidence did Vance use for that part of his argument?
He brought up a few instances, particularly in the UK, where people got in trouble for saying things that, well, went against the accepted narrative. He argued that this creates a climate where people are afraid to speak their minds, which goes against the whole idea of free speech.
That makes sense. But what's the other side of the story? I mean, European leaders aren't just going to admit to censorship and election interference, right? How do they defend themselves against these accusations?
Their main argument is that they're trying to fight disinformation, especially with all the worry about foreign interference, particularly from Russia. They say they're not trying to silence legitimate speech, just protect people from harmful propaganda.
So it's a clash between security and freedom, and Vance seems to be saying that Europe's tipping the scales too far in one direction.
Exactly. And his speech has really kicked off a debate about where that line should be. How do you protect democracy without sacrificing the very values that make it work? That's the big question Vance is putting out there.
A question with no easy answers. Before we dive more into that, though, I'm curious about the reaction to Vance's speech. We've talked about the European response, but what about back home in the U.S.?
Well, like you might expect, it was a mixed bag. Some people, like the journalist Glenn Greenwald, they saw Vance's speech as, well, kind of refreshing, like he was calling out a double standard in U.S. and EU foreign policy, saying that a lot of people were already thinking.
So not everyone thought he was way off base.
Oh, definitely not. I mean, you had Scott Ritter, the former UN weapons inspector. He even went so far as to say Vance represents a new set of American values. Values that, he said, reject European, quote-unquote, authoritarian tactics.
Wait, authoritarian tactics? That's a pretty loaded term. What exactly is he getting at there?
Ritter and others who agree with him, they're talking about things like, cracking down on what people can say online, especially stuff that's labeled as disinformation or hate speech. They also worry about how much influence governments and tech companies have in shaping what we see and hear online. Basically, they see this trend towards more control over information and public debate, and they see it as a threat to democratic principles.
I see. So it's not just about specific policies, but a bigger worry about where things are heading. Like, are we slowly losing our democratic values in the name of security?
Yeah, that's the core of their argument. They say even if these measures start with good intentions, they set a dangerous precedent that could be used to silence dissent and limit freedom of expression.
So we've got this clear division, both between the U.S. and Europe, and within the U.S. itself. Sounds like Vance's speech really hit a nerve, bringing up some underlying tensions that were maybe already bubbling under the surface.
It's like he shined a light on these fundamental questions about democracy, the balance between security and freedom, and what the future holds for the U.S. and Europe.
Lots to unpack there, for sure. But before we get too deep into that, let's take a step back. Why should our listener, who might not be a foreign policy expert, care about all this? Why does this war of words on the international stage matter to them?
Because these aren't just abstract ideas being debated in some fancy conference room. They have real-world impacts on all of us. The U.S. and Europe, their relationship has shaped global security for decades. If that relationship starts to crumble, well, it could affect things like trade, alliances, even the stability of the world as a whole.
So whether you're a diehard news junkie or just trying to understand the big picture, this clash of ideologies is worth paying attention to. It gives us a glimpse into the challenges facing democracies and the choices we have to make as a global community.
And it shows how important it is to think for yourself, to look at different perspectives, and not just take things at face value. Do your own research, look at the evidence, and form your own conclusions.
Great advice. And speaking of digging deeper, let's move on to the next part of our deep dive, where we'll explore some of the potential consequences of this rift between the U.S. and Europe. What could this mean for global security? Stick with us.
To really understand how serious Vance's accusations were, you kind of have to understand the Munich Security Conference itself.
Yeah, you're right. So help us out here. Why did his speech make such a splash in that specific setting?
Well, the Munich Security Conference, it's usually a time when the West, especially the US and Europe, they try to show a united front. They want to demonstrate that they're all committed to democracy and that they're all working together to tackle the big security threats out there. So when Vance came out and basically criticized Europe right to their faces, it really disrupted that whole vibe.
Yeah, it's like he was breaking some unwritten rule, like you keep those disagreements behind closed doors.
Exactly. And that kind of breach of protocol, it had real consequences. For example, the chairman of the conference, he was visibly upset. I mean, some were saying he was even brought to tears by what Vance was saying. It just showed how deeply Vance's words had kind of shattered the sense of unity that everyone was expecting at the event.
Wow, the chairman brought to tears. That really paints a picture. But let's get back to this idea of authoritarian tactics. That phrase that Scott Ritter used to describe some of the things that Europe's been doing. What exactly are those tactics? Can you do some concrete examples?
Sure. Critics like Ritter are pointing to things like limiting what people can say online, especially when it's labeled as disinformation or hate speech. They're also worried about the influence of governments and big tech companies in controlling what we see and read online. Basically, they see a movement towards more control over information and public discussion, which they see as fundamentally opposed to democratic principles.
So it's not just about specific policies, but a bigger worry about a slippery slope. Like they're worried that even if these measures start with good intentions, they could be used to silence dissent and limit freedom of expression.
That's exactly it. They're saying we need to be careful because even if the original goal is good, these kinds of policies could end up undermining the very freedoms they're supposed to protect.
So where do we go from here? Is there any way to bridge this gap between those who prioritize security and those who are really focused on protecting free speech?
That's the tough question, isn't it? I mean, finding non-balance, it's a real challenge, and there's no easy answer. But I think the first step is admitting that there are valid concerns on both sides. We have to move past just dismissing those who disagree with us as either naive or authoritarian.
So basically you're saying we need to be more nuanced and try to understand each other's perspectives.
Absolutely. We have to try to understand what's driving these policies in the first place. Why are some people so eager to restrict certain kinds of speech? What are they afraid of? And how can we address those fears without throwing free speech out the window?
It's a tough conversation to have for sure. But maybe this tension, this clash of ideas, maybe it can actually be a good thing.
That's what I'm hoping. Maybe it'll force us to really think about what we believe and challenge our own biases. Maybe it'll push us to have those difficult conversations about the limits of free speech and the role of government in our digital world. We need to find a way through this without resorting to easy answers or trying to scare people into agreeing with us.
You're right, it's a tall order. But I do think this could be a chance to learn and grow, to understand these fundamental principles on a deeper level. But let's bring this back down to earth for a minute. What are the practical consequences of this rift between the U.S. and Europe? What does it mean for global security?
That's a really important question and one that we'll dig into more in the next part of our deep dive.
All right, so we've been talking about this clash between the U.S. and Europe, this whole thing that got kicked off by Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference. But let's talk about the fallout for a minute. Like, what happens if this rift keeps getting bigger? What could it mean for the world?
Well, it could have some pretty big consequences for global security. We've already touched on NATO a bit.
Right, NATO. Can you remind us what that is again, for folks who aren't super familiar with all the international organizations out there?
Sure. NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's a military alliance that was formed way back after World War II. Basically, it's a promise between a bunch of countries, mostly in North America and Europe, to defend each other if one of them gets attacked.
So it's like a big team, if one member gets in trouble, everyone's got their back.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what makes this whole disagreement between the U.S. and Europe so worrisome. If they can't even agree on basic values and how to approach things, how are they supposed to work together to defend against, well, a real threat?
So you're saying this tension could actually weaken NATO and maybe even embolden countries like Russia or China?
That's definitely a possibility. If Russia or China see that the US and Europe aren't on the same page, they might be more likely to put to the limits a little bit, Maybe try some more aggressive moves, whether it's over territory or cyber attacks, or even trying to mess with elections in other countries.
That sounds a little scary, honestly. But is there any chance that maybe this whole thing could actually lead to something good? Like, could it force the U.S. and Europe to rethink their alliances or even find new partners?
It's hard to say for sure, but yeah, that's a possibility. Maybe this crisis will make both sides realize, hey, maybe there's some truth to what the other side's saying. And maybe that could lead to some kind of reset.
So instead of digging in their heels and refusing to budge, maybe they find a way to meet in the middle, to come up with a new way of working together that takes everyone's concerns into account.
That's the hope, but I would take a real effort from both sides. They'd have to be willing to compromise, to really listen to each other, and to find some common ground on all these tough issues. Free speech, security, this whole disinformation thing.
And that common ground might not look like what either side was hoping for at the start. They might have to give a little to get a little.
Absolutely. It's about finding a way to work together, even when you don't agree on everything, to build alliances that are based on respect and recognizing that you both want the same things in the end.
It's a tough challenge, but hey, maybe this is a chance to make things better.
That's the optimistic view, right? And maybe this whole situation will push everyone to think a little harder about what we want democracy to look like in the future. Not just in our own countries, but around the world.
Well said. I think the big takeaway here is that this isn't just some theoretical debate. What we're talking about has real consequences for all of us. So it's important to stay informed, to talk about these things, and to really think critically about the choices we're making, both as individuals and as a global community.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you'll keep exploring these important and complex issues. See you next time.